Armenian, so we've said hello to Padev, to Sona, all the way out in Los Angeles on your behalf. So Armenian lives are lives of journeying. This is something I've noticed. I'm married to a woman who is from a family that have been made refugees just about every generation, going back to their village life in Musada. And that journeying, I think, is something that really attracted me to trying to understand the Armenian experience. And I was trained as a Middle East historian, very traditional kind of Middle Eastern historian at UCLA. And when I first started my work, I had been interested in working on Armenian topics and thinking about the genocide and so on. But in those days at UCLA, we were warned against that. We were told, if you go down that path, you'll work with Hovhannissian and you'll never get a job. You'll never get a grant. And so I took that very seriously, as a young graduate student might, and I wrote about Arab nationalism and the middle class and so on. But the city that I decided to write about was the city of Aleppo. And I'd lived in Damascus for a year when I was perfecting my Arabic, and it was a marvelous city to live in. But we would escape to Aleppo for the weekends, and we had a great time. Aleppo was different. It had a different feel in those days. It was a town much more open to commerce, and it had this wonderfully unique characteristic. It had these Armenian neighborhoods, where you'd look up on the signs and you'd see Armenian script rather than just Arabic. You would smell forbidden smells like arak when you were walking along the streets of the town. And it was a different place, and I knew that this was a city I wanted to write about. And so in the mid-1990s, I returned to the city of Aleppo to work on my doctoral dissertation. Just to prove I was there, here's a photograph of me. And I look at this photograph and I have nice brown chestnut hair and no gray in my beard. But this is also a very bittersweet photograph for me. This was Hegnar, my wife is an Islamic art historian who's right now finishing a book on the Zaytun Gospels. And this is a rooftop in the old city of Aleppo, sort of looking towards the Grand Umayyad Mosque, the minaret of the Grand Umayyad Mosque, which dates originally from about the 9th century. Well, that's gone. It was blown up during the Civil War in Aleppo. But it was 1995, and Hegnar and I decided, a little bit later in the spring, we go out to the Armenian cemetery that's on the outskirts of town. And the scouts are having a little gathering there, middle of April, for April 24th. And we're walking around, and we come across this grave. And it was for a woman by the name of Karan Yeppe, or Jeppe, right? And it's said in Danish, Armenian mother of Armenians. Who is this person? Right? That's always a good historian, right? When you walk around, you see something you don't quite understand, you think, who is this? And that was the first step in a journey that began to force me to ask some questions about Aleppo and about survivor communities, the relationship of survivor communities to indigenous communities, the people who are already there, and towards eventually to studying the rescue movement, the gathering of the orphans and others in the period after the First World War, and the significant role that was played by Karan Yeppe and other foreign humanitarians in that work. What also drew me to this was, the fact that I was married to someone, as I said before, who was descended from refugees. And the more time I spent with my wife, talking to her, which is, a pleasant thing to do usually, is learning more and more about the Musada Armenians. And learning about the 40 days and the rescue, and my interest began to I became very interested in them as refugees, especially because they were organized into what many of us think was the very first modern refugee camp, here located in Port Said. And this is a photo that my friend Jeff helped me find from the Harvard Library. This is a really interesting photograph to me. You see the tents are lined up in straight lines, and the refugee men are being marched out of the camp under guard, not because they did anything wrong, but because they're being taken to factories where they're going to work to help pay for their presence in Egypt. It was surrounded by barbed wire, entrance and egress from the camp was monitored. People had identification. There's a beautiful map of the camp, an archival map of the camp that tells us which families lived in which tents, in fact. And so I was intrigued by this as well. And so that process of understanding the Musada Armenians and their survival after the war, of living in Aleppo, a place with this giant Armenian community, all these issues began to coalesce in my mind as important questions. And because we did that, okay. Let's see. I'm opposed to PowerPoint, but maybe I should have done one. Because of that issue of Karnyepe, of survivors and so on, I followed the trail then of these questions to the League of Nations archive in Geneva, where I'd heard about the registry of the Aleppo rescue home. And I talked about this last time I was here. It was a long time ago, maybe you forgot. So I'll tell you more about it right now. But of course, Aleppo was there in the northern part of Syria, and many of the women who had been trafficked during the genocide, you know these stories, right, where the caravans were moved through the desert, they would be attacked by Bedouin or Kurds or others, women would be taken from the caravans, or they'd be sold by their escorts into various forms of slavery, enslavement. And what happened after the war is that with the Allied occupation, the creation of the Faisal's Arab Kingdom, Armenian groups and others would go out and rescue or facilitate the rescue or the retransfer of women back to the Armenian community. But one thing I discovered, and something that, on this journey that became very important to me, was when you read the stories, like the story of Zabel, the daughter of Bedros from Arapgir, is that it wasn't so much that Western humanitarians and others were going out and rescuing them. The trafficked women, the refugees themselves, were beginning to exert agency over their own lives. And in this case, she rescued herself. She heard about that her family might have been living in Aleppo from an Armenian Model T driver who was out in the northern desert near Kobani, which is now a city very much in the news, and Ras Al Ain, and she made her way to Aleppo, and we know about this through a story told about her in the third person, where she was given a haircut and put in a modern outfit, and they located a living sibling, and she was reunited with him. But it was these stories like this, and I've written elsewhere about how these kinds of stories, and when you read enough of them, they begin to really tear at you. Brought up another issue that I wanted to think about in this story of humanitarianism. So these things were starting to fall together. And the question that emerged from these archives, and one more archive that I was very interested in as well, the archive of Near East Relief and of the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, was what was the role of the international response to the Armenian genocide in the creation of what we now call modern humanitarianism. And humanitarianism is defined in many ways, but one of the best definitions of humanitarianism is organized compassion. Why are people moved by the suffering of strangers half a world away to organize themselves through governments, through non-governmental organizations? Why are they willing to spend millions of dollars to help people they've never met and do things like this? And that led me finally to wanting to tell the story in part of Near East Relief. Now, many of you know about Near East Relief. This is one of the things that Armenians point to with a great deal of pride. The current head of the Near East Foundation, which is the successor to Near East Relief, is a man by the name of Shant Matarosyan, who is Armenian. That Near East Relief was an organization that was founded during the First World War, primarily to address the suffering of Armenians in the Near East. And so I wanted to understand why they did that. It wasn't just that the Armenian, this was the First World War. There was a great deal of suffering occurring in the world at that time. The United States wasn't even at war in the Ottoman Empire. Why would they be interested in this, in doing this, in in doing something for these people half a world away. And so the focus of my research, on all these various issues, the focus of my research then began to turn to one man, a man whose life I was very familiar with because of another starting point, or a point on this journey of this book. And that's Stanley Kerr, who's seen here dressed in a Near East Relief uniform. And Near East Relief was organized during the war and then did most of its work after the war in something that's very interesting and wouldn't necessarily be done today by modern or contemporary humanitarians. The men would dress in sort of these modified World War I uniforms, and then women always had women volunteers often dressed in these sort of white outfits to distinguish themselves. And this is an image of Kerr at a picnic, of all things, right, in the city of Madash, sometime in 1920. And he's surrounded mostly by his bodyguards, which tells you something about Madash at that moment in history. And they're having, looks like walnuts or dates down here, some other fruits and vegetables, a couple bottles of something, and then tins that were filled with food. And there's a couple smiles, but not a lot. And so I was wondering why Kerr was interested in going. I was also interested in Kerr because I was very good friends with Ann Kerr. She had been someone who was part of our lives at UCLA for many years. After her husband Malcolm Kerr had been murdered at AUB, she had come back to UCLA, where they had lived much of their lives to work. He's more famous now where I teach as being the grandfather, Stanley, as being the grandfather of Steve Kerr, who's the coach of the Golden State Warriors. Not kidding at all. Why would you do this? Why would you travel across the world to help people out? And so so those are some of the questions that I wanted to try to answer. And so I thought I'd move now to read a couple passages from my book to you that try to explore why Kerr did what he did. And then also read a couple passages, or one passage, exploring the impact of those actions on Armenian orphan lives. So not only will we look at, will I read to you a passage that sort of tries my best to account for why someone would care, but then understanding how that caring did something for the Armenian community and the Armenian survivors of the genocide. Let me get my copy of the book. And then I have to put on my old man reading glasses. Goodness.
They look very good.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. So this is from a part of my book called America's Wards, which examines Near East Relief's relationship with the Armenian community in the period after the First World War. And part of the argument I make is that American Near East Relief viewed the Armenians as a kind of vanguard for a new Near East. In fact, it wasn't just about helping Armenian suffering, it was also about trying to bring to the Middle East, some might say impose on the Middle East, an American vision of modernity. And the Armenians were going to be the vanguard for this. They were going to be at the very forefront. Because the community had been so devastated, the American relief mission saw itself as being able to shape it and form it in a certain way. Now, this wasn't universally well received by the Armenians, especially the Armenian church, and it certainly wasn't even unanimous amongst the relief workers who worked in the field. And I think contemporary relief workers would agree with the statement that what happens in New York or Washington, D.C. about directing policy sometimes fails when it gets out into the reality of the field. So, come back. No. Okay. So Kerr came to the humanitarian enterprise through a very unique way. At the time he joined Near East Relief, he had been working in the medicinal chemistry laboratory of Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C., and was facing demobilization with few job prospects and little money for his avowed goal an advanced degree in organic chemistry. His decision to go to the Middle East was based not on any prior knowledge of the region, and was instead simply a spontaneous choice made at the prompting of a superior officer at the medical center. Kerr's introduction to the region occurred en route to the Eastern Mediterranean on board the SS Leviathan, a luxury liner that had been converted to a troop transport ship during the war. Aboard ship, Kerr, alongside 250 new Near East recruits, including former U.S. Army nurses and doctors, received an abbreviated education on what had happened to the Armenians during the war itself, both from returning missionaries and what were becoming the Near East Relief's canonical texts, Toynbee's Blue Book, Ambassador Morgenthau's story, and Clarence Usher's 1917, An American Physician in Turkey. Arriving in Istanbul, then under joint Allied occupation, Kerr was assigned to Aleppo in May of 1919 in the post-war Arab-Syrian kingdom. That city, alongside Beirut, was the major collection point for Armenian refugees. As the initial post-war plan to restore the Armenians to south-central Anatolia took shape, Aleppo became the hub for relief work activities. Kerr's letters home in this early period tell the story of a young man enjoying the novelty of Aleppo in southern Anatolia, from describing the sounds of Arab weddings and the thrill of boar hunting and his collection of handicrafts, to asking his parents to send money for a planned trip, floating down the Tigris on a raft at the end of his contract in the spring of 1920, sort of like a junior year abroad student writing home. In these early letters, Kerr voiced a great confidence and optimism in the Near East Relief Project. That enthusiasm was shared by the Near East Relief leadership, which believed that the American Relief Agency would have a largely unfettered role in setting up hospitals and implementing refugee resettlement. Kerr perceived his job as not just immediate relief, but also an act of what today would be called restorative justice for the Armenians. The key program was the repatriation of Armenians to their homelands under the auspices of a European protectorate. However, across the summer and fall of 1919, Kerr began to encounter elements of the humanitarian crisis and larger political context that did not fit neatly into that program. Those elements forced him to begin to question the feasibility and, at times, even the justice of Near East Relief's overall strategy. The first was Kerr's introduction to the complex problem posed by the massive transfer of Armenian children from their families into Turkish and Bedouin households in Syria. In some cases, these children were placed in state orphanages, where they were converted to Islam. Authorities also distributed children to Muslim families as foster children. Still others were stolen from the deportation caravans and sold or traded en route. Kerr and Near East Relief officials in Aleppo, with the official support of the Arab Kingdom, had begun to cooperate with Armenian organizations to recover these children in areas under Allied occupation. In one instance, Kerr traveled to the nearby city of Bab, which is now under Daesh occupation, to recover Armenian children, primarily adolescent girls, who had been integrated into Arab households. He recalled meeting with a sheikh who had several children in his household he claimed to have taken from the homes of their murdered parents in Aintab in the spring of 1915. The sheikh told Kerr that he had treated them as his own children, and Kerr believed that the children loved the man as a father based on his brief visit. Quote, "Now are you going to take these children from me after I've protected them during the past 4 years?" He remembered the sheikh asking him. Kerr claims, quote, "If I could have foreseen the future for the Armenians of Aintab, who faced incredible violence that year, I would have decided immediately to leave these children where they were loved. But I had been commissioned to get them and allowed my sense of duty to override sentiment. Quote, I have no choice, I said to the sheikh. The Emir Faisal had ordered that they should return to their own community. I must take them to Aleppo." Kerr was clearly moved by the condition of the children, who also objected to being taken to the city to rejoin their community. For Kerr, the pragmatic reality that the children appeared safe and cared for outweighed his sense, perhaps in retrospect, that the reconstitution of the Armenian community was the overriding cause. At the most basic level, he was caught between the problem of the individual humanity of the children and the problem for humanity that Near East Relief had arrogated to itself to solve. The conditions that Kerr witnessed near Bab were far from unique, and among present-day Armenians, there's even a sense of gratitude to the Bedouin for taking in so many vulnerable children. However, as children were brought into rescue homes, established by Near East Relief, where they were processed, including being photographed, they also were asked to explain what had happened to them in the years between the onset of the genocide and their rescue. While the records from the Near East Relief administered rescue home are lost, many of the reports from the years when it was under the control of the League of Nations, like the one I showed you, remain a useful source for understanding that the children faced conditions of slavery, and for the girls, serial rape and forced marriage. In November 1919, Kerr wrote to his family detailing the laborious work of photographing orphan children at the Near East Relief Facility in Aintab. Similar to the work of the rescue home, where photographs and personal data were put to use trying to find living relatives or rescued children, the Near East Relief hoped to reunite families and raise funds. Kerr writes, at Aintab, he's writing to his family, at Aintab, I photographed 960 orphans and had a record made of each child's name, its parents' names, and a story of each one's experiences during the war. These will be copied, and the copies with photos sent to America with an appeal for individuals to support or, quote-unquote, adopt orphans. It was lots of fun doing this work, as all the kids like to be photoed. At Marash, I'm to do the same thing, unquote. By the time he had completed the work at Marash, Kerr had photographed and transcribed, with the help of a translator, the stories of nearly 2,000 children. In a letter to his father in mid-December 1919, he writes, quote, the stories these little kids can tell about their experiences are awfully interesting, the way they are told, unquote. Picking at one at random from his desk, he recounts the rough translation of the story of Vartanush Seferian, a 17-year-old orphan housed at the Near East Relief Orphanage in Marash. Quote, our family was composed of 11 members. My brother, in America, was married, and his wife was with us with her 2 sons. My 3 sisters and 1 brother at home were married, so they all started with us. First, we were exiled to a place called Hasanoğlu for 4 months. There, Turks made a massacre. They took our properties. We fled back to Kemash. At the war, Turk women killed with axes my father and mother and also my uncles. When we reached Kemash, Turks threw into river my nephews. An officer took one of my brother's wife, so I fled to Kemash back. There the Kaimakam of Kemash took me, and I was a servant in his family as many as 4 years. When Russian army came, so many Armenian widows fled to them. It was announced that none of the Turks would keep Armenians in his house, so Kaimakam sent me away, and I came to Marash with a Muslim. At the same time, my brother's wife fled to Russian army. After 2 days of my arrival to Marash, I was put by the aid of Armenians to rescue home. There I lived nearly 8 months, but now I am in Near East Relief Orphanage, unquote. It is perhaps evident